Hello everybody and welcome to the Chronicles of Yarnia. This is Erika and today we're going to be learning how to knit in the round. It seems more complicated than it actually is, but you can knit in the round if you're trying to create something like a sock, for example, and what we're going to be creating is actually this beginning of this sock so you can understand the process. There will be later tutorials on sock making to show you alternate ways of creating a sock heel, as well as a pretty standard way of creating a sock. And there are different ways of going about this, from top to bottom or bottom to top. Everybody's got a favorite way of doing it. I prefer top down, but sometimes I've even used the bottom up patterns, either in knitting or crochet, to create a sock. But what we're focusing on today is really just the process of knitting in the round, that is creating a tubular, circular piece of knitting that joins itself and allows you to knit in a little spiral. You can make these pieces as small or as large as you like. You can start from an I-cord, which is a very basic, easy way of doing knitting in the round, just one stitch at a time. Or you can do 20 stitches and knit those stitches in the round, to 60 stitches, to 250 stitches or more, depending on what you're trying to create. Maybe you want to make a sweater and you want to knit that whole thing in one piece as opposed to separate pieces like a front and a back. So what we're going to do today is knit in the round. So I hope you're ready. What you're going to need are some double pointed knitting needles. Now, I prefer double pointed knitting needles oftentimes to circular knitting needles, just because I've gotten used to working with the double pointed needles. And if you can see, a double pointed needle is just like this, a regular knitting needle, except instead of having a little nub at the end to stop the yarn from passing through, you have 2 points. And the 2 points allow you to slip your stitches and knit your stitches or purl your stitches on either end of the needle. And what you're going to be doing is aligning a series of 3 or more needles in such a fashion that you create a triangular or square pattern, which eventually turns into a circle once you're done knitting. So you're going to need some double pointed needles. Between 4 and 5 is a good number to start with, just because if you have more stitches you might want to have 5. If you have fewer stitches you might only want to use 4, so you can put the stitches cast onto 3 needles and then work with the 4th needle to knit onto that needle. This set actually I got from my grandmother. It came with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 needles. I've never used 8 double pointed needles at a time, but it is nice to have that option in case I slip a stitch, drop a stitch, or need to do something kind of funky to my knitting that would require an extra needle. But we're not going to get into that today. You can also use circular needles. Circular needles are just, they look like regular needles. They look a lot like this, but obviously they're usually shorter, about half of the length of these needles here, and they don't have these ends. Instead they have a cord connecting the 2 ends, and the cord is usually made of some kind of plastic that is slightly pliable. And what you do is you knit onto one needle, then you join the round and you continue knitting, and it creates a spiral. And this is really the same exact process as what you're doing with the double pointed needles, but instead of using double pointed needles you're using a circular needle. So it's just a matter of preference. A lot of people prefer the circular needles because they avoid jogs in between your knitting needles that you get from double pointed knitting. If you're not careful and don't knit tightly in between the needles, you can sometimes have an extra space, which we call jogs or ladders. Excuse me, not jogs, ladders. You're going to have ladders in between your in weird places in your knitting, which you'll know they're ladders because they literally look like a ladder. It doesn't look like the knit stitch where it's the perfect little V, or the purl stitch where it's the little bump. So to avoid that, you can just knit tightly, and I will show you how to do that as well. So without further ado, here is knitting in the round. So I just wanted to show you what circular knitting needles look like. I realize I didn't get around to that in the first piece. These are circular knitting needles. As you can see, they look almost the same as double pointed needles, like two double pointed needles, except where it tapers at the end, it's joined to a plastic cord. And you can find these in all different sizes and all different textures, types of materials. These are metal, as you can hear, and they make a little clinking sound every time you do a stitch, so if you're easily annoyed, that's probably not what you're looking for. Then there are these plastic ones, which I think these are size 10 or 11. These are just what they are, plastic needles, and they're very lightweight. And what I've found sometimes with circular knitting needles is the longer you have them, the more likely the cord is to coil. So what you can do to solve that is you can soak it in warm to hot water, and just let it kind of sit under the water, and you'll see this sort of smoothing effect happen, and you won't get the curl completely out of it because you do want a bit of a curve to your cord, but it will get out some of this extra nonsense here. And then my favorites in terms of circular knitting needles are these bamboo knitting needles. These are from Takumi. This is a size 13, and that is 9 millimeters. As you can see, the cord isn't too kinked up. It's just pretty straightforward, and so there you go, circular knitting needles. If you do choose to use circular knitting needles, the process of joining in the round is relatively the same. Just instead of splitting your stitches onto multiple needles, you're going to keep it on your circular needle and then use your right hand needle to join what you've knit onto your left hand needle, and then continue knitting. I will also have a tutorial on magic loop knitting, which is a great way of knitting a smaller amount of stitches than your circular knitting needle allows for. For example, this cord is, I don't know how many inches, maybe like 20 something inches long. But say I want to knit something that's only 10 inches and I want to use circular knitting needles. What I can do is I can put the 10 inches of stitches on my left part of my needle, and I can create a loop in the back and knit half of the stitches, and then transfer those stitches over to the other side of the needle, and then knit the other half of those stitches, and continue in that fashion, knitting half and then transferring, knitting half and then transferring, making sure to switch needles each time. It sounds more complicated than it is, but once you learn how to do that, it's so easy to knit things like socks or hats or anything that you might need that's going to be smaller than the length of needle you have, which I think is way more convenient than having to go out and buy needles with circular needles with a very short cord, because you also don't know how often you're going to use those, just because they're for very niche projects. So that's what circular needles look like. I hope you make the right choice and pick what works for you, but we will have more on circular knitting in another episode. I just wanted to get that out there so you knew there were options. We're going to be using these double pointed needles. I've got a lot of them, and we're going to now finally knit in the round. Okay, so here you have a sort of process that it will seem daunting at first, but it really isn't. The most finicky part of knitting with double pointed needles in the round is the first round. So once you get through that, if you can pull through it, you'll find that it's very easy to knit in the round. It's more fun than knitting on straight needles and single pointed needles. yeah, so you'll actually come to enjoy it if you keep practicing. So we're going to start with, I'm going to have 4 needles. I have my yarn here. This is the Arne and Carlos line of Regia yarn, sock yarn, and it's a really cool yarn because it has a pattern embedded in the colors of the yarn. So without having to change color or learn how to do color work like this, you can create a pattern that looks like this in a sock, which I think is so cool because it's just so simple. You don't have to worry about switching colors or having any kind of weird stuff on the inside of your sock. So we're going to make the other sock to this pair. This took me a few days, not whole days, but you know, a few hours each day, and I just kind of, you know, put on Netflix and got knitting, and this is what I got. So we're going to start from the top up here and work our way down. We're only going to get to like about right here in this video, just so you can learn about the process of joining in the round. So now that we've discussed that, let's go ahead and take our yarn. What I need to make sure is that I've got the correct part of the yarn to go along with this sock. That's the only quirk of having yarn that has patterns in it. So if the red comes up soon, and we will know this is the correct part of the yarn. There's the green. We've got white. This may not be the part we need, but you know what? Actually, I don't mind. I don't want to waste any yarn, so I'm going to start it from here and have 2 slightly different pattern socks, and that will make me happy. So, okay, what we do first is cast on. So we're going to take 1 double pointed needle, and casting on with double pointed needles is very much the same as casting on with single tip needles. All you do is create a slip knot. So you're going to take your yarn, loop it around, put your fingers through the loop and grab the longer part of the yarn and pull it through. And there you've got your slip knot. And it's a mobile knot, so you just put it on your needle, tighten it up, and there you have your first stitch. Now instead of putting a stitch marker here so we know where the beginning of the round is, we're just going to leave it as such because the tail of the yarn actually shows us that this is the beginning of the round. So I'm going to cast on 60 stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, bear with me, 18, 19, and 20. So, okay, we've stopped at 20, and why I did that is because we're trying to split these stitches onto 3 separate needles. So what you can either do is continue casting on all 60 stitches onto one needle and then transfer 20 stitches onto each other needle just by slipping the stitches onto the needle, or you can just do it from the get-go and hold your second needle. You're going to hold it behind the other needle, and you're going to cast onto that second needle, making sure it's tight, hold tight and close to the other needle. So just kind of yank it and really get it in there. That way you know there's not going to be a ladder. That part takes a little bit of practice, but once you do it, it actually becomes easier. Just make sure it's firmly in there, and you'll know because when you sort of let it dangle, it kind of dangles close to the initial 20 stitches. So you might find that if you're using metal needles that it's kind of slippery. And that's what I mean when I say it's the most finicky round, round 1, because you're constantly having to worry about the tightness of your stitches and whether your work will be kept on the needles. So just watch out for that. So now that we've done the one stitch, we're going to continue casting on. So 1, 2, and as you can see, it already got a little loose there, but that's something that can be corrected, so don't worry about it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and as you can see, my technique for casting on, it's kind of fast, but if it's easy once you start doing it. What you do is you wrap the thread around the outside of your fingers of your working hand, and you take your working needle, you go under, over, and over again, and pull. And that will create the stitch. So let's see, let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Actually, that gave me an extra stitch, but I'm not really worried about that because for some reason it looks right. So once again, under, over, pull through. Wrap, under, over, pull through. Wrap, under, over, pull through. Wrap, under, over, pull through. Let me just count really quickly. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and one more makes 20. So now we have 40 stitches. And don't really worry about anything getting twisted at this point because you can straighten it all out when you join in the round. So now I'm going to take my third needle right here, and these are size 3 knitting needles, so they're kind of somewhat large for knitting socks, but you can go all the way to a size 0 if you're looking for a really small needle and you want really detailed socks. However, this yarn is most amenable to between a size 2 and 3 needle, and that's also what I'm working with in terms of double pointed needles, so let's continue. I'm going to cast on the last 20 stitches. So we'll take our last needle that we cast onto, and we're going to grab onto that. Kind of let the first needle fall a little bit. Don't really be that responsible for it because it's kind of taken care of at this point. And then you're going to take your third needle and put it behind the other needle. This takes a little bit of finagling, but you can do it. And cast onto that needle. The trick with double pointed knitting is just work with the needle that you're working with at that point. Ignore the other needles until you get back to them. So there's 1, 2, 3, that tail's getting in the way, let me move it out of the way, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. You want to get your work on the inside of your needles. That is the part that is kind of bumpy. So we're going to rotate until that is on the inside of each needle, and that it makes sure that it's not twisted in between each needle. And as you can see, that's pretty aligned. So what you're going to do then is join the round. So you're going to take your needle with the working yarn in it, which is this one with the long strand of yarn attached to the ball of yarn. And you're going to hold it close to the other needle, and because we're working with 4 needles, we're going to grab the 4th needle, and with the work on the inside, like so, we're going to dip knitwise into that first stitch. I don't know if you can see that, but see the first stitch there, and you know it's the first stitch because it's got the tail. You're going to dip into that knitwise, and with your working yarn and all the work facing the inside of the needles, wrap and pull through that first stitch. And this is your knit stitch. This is your joining stitch that joins in the round. And as you can see, you've created a triangle here. And you're just going to keep going. What makes it easy is you slide your stitches that you're working with, those first stitches you knit, onto the end of the needle. Not too far because you don't want them to all slip off, but close enough that you can work with them. And once you've created that first stitch, you of course slip off the stitch off of the first needle, and then you try and find where you can knit that. Sometimes it's difficult because if you knit tight like I do sometimes, I don't know, I vary between knitting tight and loosely. There you go. And then you can wrap, pull through. And it's just like knitting any other piece that you would knit, except you're doing it in the round now. So what helps sometimes, if you're not too picky about knitting through the front loop versus knitting through the back loop, you can knit through the back loop, because sometimes if you knit tightly, that's an easy way to get a stitch picked up that doesn't require too much strain, that lets your stitches look basically the same. So actually, I'm having trouble doing that, but let's see if I can get it. There we go. So we've knit through the back loop, wrap around, pull through, lift the loop up, and then we're going to go through and do it again. And you're just going to keep knitting in this pattern. My sock pattern calls for 3 rounds of just knitting of stockinette stitch. Knitting in the round stockinette stitch is different from knitting on straight needles stockinette stitch, because in stockinette stitch on straight needles, what you do is you knit onto one needle, then you knit onto the other, purl onto the other needle, and you turn your work, and you purl, and you turn your work, and you knit, and then you turn your work, and you purl, and so on, and that's stockinette stitch. However, when you're doing knitting in the round, you just knit each row. You don't stop to purl. That's because you're not really flipping the work. You're working literally in a round. You're going around a circle, and the knit side is facing you, and you continue knitting. So you're going to slip your needle if it allows you to. I know this seems challenging, but what seems challenging on the first round becomes much easier on the second round. And actually you'll have a much easier time if you cast on slightly loosely, not too loose, but loose enough that you can get your needle in there without this sort of hassle that I'm having right now. And let's just do one more stitch here, and then we can conclude. But as you can see, I've got some sort of a triangle here of my knit work, and this is a really stubborn stitch. There we go. And we're knitting. Okay, and so as you can see, we've gotten some stitches onto the 4th needle, and we're going to continue doing that until all the stitches on the first needle are on the fourth needle, and you use the first needle, which will then be empty, right, to knit the second needle. And you're just going to go around, take out the needle that's not being used, use it to knit the next round, the next part of the round, and onward. And if you're using a row counter, you can click the row counter when you get to where the tail is, which is the beginning. So we'd have to knit a whole round in order to see the effect of that. So I'm going to finish knitting this round, and then I'm going to show you, actually before finishing knitting this round, what happens when you finish the very last stitch, and how you actually move on to the next part of the round. Okay, so I've knit the first needle onto the fourth needle, and now my first needle, what was initially my first needle here, has one stitch left on it. So I'm going to show you what happens and how you continue in the round when you're at the end of one needle. So you can still see we've got the triangle shape here in the middle. None of my stitches are twisted, even though there's a little bit of a curve to them in parts. It's not really twisted. It's all sort of in the same area, and you can see how work is starting to form here where I have just knit. So you're going to knit that last stitch. So I've already inserted my needle. I'm going to wrap around, pull through, and then pull it off of the needle, and then I've got this free needle right here. So I'm going to pull my work tight on the needle I just finished, slide it kind of to the middle of the needle so there's no risk of it falling off of the needle, and then I'm going to move on to the next portion, which you can see looks a little loose. This is where ladders often develop, right here, if you don't correct that. So we're going to correct that now just by knitting tightly the first stitch in between the two needles. So I'm going to take the needle that I just got all the stitches off of, and that's my new working needle. And that really helps you if you have an economy situation where you want to only use a small amount of needles. You don't have to pick up extra needles. You just work with the one you just removed. Also great if you're taking the project on the road with you. You only have a set number of needles. So I'm going to slide the work to the edge of this needle here, and then I'm going to attempt to get my needle, my working needle, into the last stitch here, or I'm sorry, the first stitch on this needle, and it's a little tricky. I will tell you that much, but once you sort of get the right angle, you can just sort of slip your needle in. And don't let it discourage you if it takes a while, because it is so satisfying to knit in the round and to have a project that is in the round, tubular knitting. And actually, I made a mistake of having my yarn at the front, so let me undo that. Put my yarn back to the back, because I'm knitting, not purling. Reorganize myself a little bit here. And once again, slip in and wrap around. Now when I wrap around, I'm going to pull it as tight as I can so that it's really close to the needle with the working thread on it, a working yarn on it. And I'm going to pull through. And there we have it. Now you can see that even though there was this jog here, this ladder here, now this first stitch is quite close to the other needle. And you'll continue to correct that if you keep knitting tightly. Then you won't have any spaces in between your stitches. Some people like to fix those ladders later, going in and sewing the stitches. I don't really enjoy doing that if I can avoid it. I like to just correct the problem while I'm knitting. So this is basically how you knit in the round. You just keep going, and you will eventually have, from this triangle, well, going to be square, but this triangle here will form a line of work, a spiral of work inside, and it's going to build up and up and up until you have this sort of tube here that you have for the sock. And this sock, even though it looks complex, was begun just as this was begun, with just knitting 60 stitches, casting 60 stitches on, and knitting those stitches for 3 rows, then knitting some ribbing for about 16 or 10 centimeters. I don't really know, about 5 to 10 centimeters here, or a couple of inches. And then switching from the ribbed pattern, and ribbing we know makes things stretchy, so that's why we need that at the cuff of the sock, to just knit stitches. And you can see these are knit stitches because they're all V's. The difference between this and the ribbing is the ribbing has V's. If you stretch it upwards, you'll see the V's right here, but in between the V's there are bumps. Those are purls. So you create a knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around, and that creates your ribbing and gives it a stretch. So once you're done with the ribbing on this sock, you just knit and knit and knit until you get to the heel, and the heel is the only complicated part of the sock making process, because the heel requires you to do short rows. And whether you're doing a boomerang heel or just a regular short row heel, this is a boomerang heel, you will see that short rows are actually not as complicated as they seem. It's just about going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until you have a very small number of stitches, and then joining that to your other stitches that you left behind when you were doing the short rows, and continuing to work in the round after that point. And so you can see you're going to do the heel, and then once you finish the heel, you're going to continue knitting in the round to create the foot of the sock. And here I even have a little cable pattern on the top of the sock, which is also simple, but requires some instructions. So just stay tuned and we'll get into the details of that. And in future episodes, we'll also talk about decreases. This has a slanted toe decrease, which is done with the slip slip knit and knit 2 together. And you can see the decrease as such. See how the pattern sort of varies there. And this pattern actually had the cables going down the sides of the sock here and here, but I switched it so that the cables were on the top and the bottom of the sock, because I like the look of a cable on the top of the sock. I think that looks really nice. And on the bottom, you know, it's kind of negligible, you don't really notice it, but it's quite fun. And so that is knitting in the round. Good luck with your knitting. I hope you do not get frustrated with your knitting in the round, because it is quite a fun process. So that's it for our tutorial on knitting in the round with double pointed needles. I hope you'll join us in the future to learn about the magic loop method of knitting, and there also will be some tutorials on crocheting socks. So if you would like to learn how to crochet a sock and you find that simpler than knitting, or if you find knitting simpler than crocheting, I will also have tutorials on knitting socks. So I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for entering the world of the Chronicles of Yarnia, and there will be more to come. Bye!